Episode 4: Vietnam, Woodstock, and the Sound of Revolution.
Some folks are born made to wave the flag, ooh, they're red, white, and blue. And when the band plays "Hail to the Chief," ooh, they point the cannon at you, Lord. It ain't me, it ain't me. I ain't no senator, song. It ain't me, it ain't me. I ain't no fortunate one, no.
It wasn't an anthem anymore. It was a battlefield. Every bend, every wail, a body in the mud. This wasn't patriotism. This was protest. And it was happening at the biggest counterculture gathering in history. Woodstock, 1969. This was the 60s hitting its peak. Music as resistance, as religion, as rebellion. But here's the question we're going to answer today. Did it stop a war, or just soundtrack one? Act 1. From hymns to hammers, the birth of movement music. Before the amps exploded, before Hendrix made his guitar scream, before Dylan went electric, there was a song that proved music could actually build movements, not just soundtrack them, build them from the ground up. We Shall Overcome didn't start as a protest song. It started as a hymn, I'll overcome someday.
This world is one great battlefield with forces all arrayed. If in my heart I do not yield, I'll overcome someday.
Written by Charles Albert Tindley in 1903. But by the 1960s, it had become something unprecedented, a song that could organize mass resistance. The transformation happened in the 1940s at Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, where Pete Seeger learned it from Zilphia Horton, who'd learned it from striking tobacco workers. Each generation changed it slightly, made it more collective, more powerful. I Shall Overcome became We Shall Overcome. Personal struggle became collective action. And when the civil rights movement exploded in the 1950s, they had a song that could turn individual courage into mass coordination. Here's what made it revolutionary. It wasn't just performed, it was participated in. Every civil rights meeting started with We Shall Overcome. Every march, every sit-in, every jail cell. The song became the organizing technology. Martin Luther King Jr. called it the anthem of the civil rights movement. But it was more than that. It was the instruction manual. We Shall Overcome wasn't a hope, it was a strategy. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday, wasn't faith. It was coordination. By 1963, when Joan Baez led 250,000 people in singing it at the March on Washington, We Shall Overcome had done something no protest song had done before. It had actually organized the people singing it into a movement powerful enough to change federal law. This is where Bob Dylan learned how music could actually work. Not from Woody Guthrie's individual rebellion, but from watching We Shall Overcome coordinate thousands of people into disciplined, nonviolent resistance. Dylan's early protest songs borrowed the organizing power of "We Shall Overcome," but applied it to different struggles. "Blowin' in the Wind" had the same collective singability, the same way of turning personal questions into shared purpose. Joan Baez understood this completely. She didn't just perform at civil rights events. She used her concerts to teach "We Shall Overcome" to college audiences who'd never been to a black church or a labor meeting. The FBI was watching, and they understood what they were seeing. This wasn't just entertainment or even political expression. This was organizational technology. A song that could coordinate mass resistance was a weapon. Bureau agents attended civil rights meetings specifically to document how "We Shall Overcome" was being used to organize protesters. They were building a database of songs that created movements, not just songs that expressed opinions. Because they'd learned something crucial. "We Shall Overcome" proved that the right song, used correctly, could actually threaten existing power structures, not symbolically, practically. Bob Dylan walked into the gaslight in 1961 with "We Shall Overcome" ringing in his ears from civil rights meetings. But when he opened his mouth, out came something different. Questions instead of answers. Ambiguity instead of instruction.
How many roads must a man walk down before you call him a man? How many seas must the white dove sail before she sleeps in the sand? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind.
"Blowin' in the Wind" borrowed the organizing power of "We Shall Overcome." The way it made everyone who sang it part of something larger. But Dylan was too smart to copy the civil rights playbook directly. He knew the FBI was watching. Joan Baez was the bridge between the two worlds. She'd literally sung "We Shall Overcome" with Martin Luther King Jr., then brought Dylan to the March on Washington. She understood how church organizing songs worked and taught Dylan to smuggle that power into folk music. The FBI was watching, and they were learning. They had files on Dylan thicker than his songbook because they'd seen what "We Shall Overcome" could do. They understood that certain songs didn't just reflect movements, they created them. Bureau agents who'd been tracking civil rights organizing knew the difference between entertainment and organization. Dylan's songs had the same participatory power as "We Shall Overcome," the same way of turning individual listeners into collective actors. But here's what the FBI missed. Dylan was deliberately avoiding the specific organizing instructions that made "We Shall Overcome" so powerful. He was keeping the emotional mechanism while removing the tactical blueprint. Then came 1965, the draft escalation. Suddenly, those gentle folk songs about peace and love weren't enough anymore. The machine was feeding boys into the jungle, and acoustic guitars started to feel like cap guns in a real war. Dylan went electric at Newport in '65, and the purists booed. But the kids who were eligible for the draft heard something else. They heard folk music growing teeth, "We Shall Overcome" getting amplifiers. But let's talk about what was happening behind the scenes while kids were discovering protest music. The record industry was discovering something beautiful. Rebellion sells, and it sells even better when you package it right. Columbia Records signed Dylan not because they believed in civil rights, but because they believed in profit margins. Folk music was cheap to produce, just voices and acoustic instruments. No big orchestras, no expensive studio sessions, pure profit. When Blowin' in the Wind by Peter, Paul, and Mary hit #2 on the charts in 1963, every A&R man in New York started scouring coffee houses for the next Dylan. Folk music wasn't dangerous counterculture anymore. It was a market demographic. The Hootenanny TV show tried to sanitize the whole movement, featuring clean-cut folk acts singing about love and flowers while carefully avoiding anyone who might actually protest something. It was folk music with the folk removed. This created a split that would define protest music forever: authentic versus commercial. The real folk singers, the ones playing for civil rights workers in Mississippi and draft resistors in Boston, versus the ones playing for suburban families watching TV. Bob Dylan navigated this by being impossible to pin down. Every time they tried to package him, he changed. Folk to rock to country to Christian. Always one step ahead of the marketing department. But not everyone could pull off that trick. Right here, in the mid-60s, the music industry established a pattern it still follows. Find an authentic cultural movement, sign the most marketable artists from that movement, then gradually sand off the edges until what remains is safe for mass consumption. But the kids weren't interested in safe anymore. The war was escalating, the draft was breathing down their necks, and acoustic folk songs about peace and love were starting to sound like lullabies while the house burned down. Act 2. When the music went to war. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but when it came, it hit like a lightning strike. Dylan plugged in. The Byrds electrified folk standards, and suddenly, protest music had amplifiers. Buffalo Springfield's For What It's Worth dropped in 1966, ostensibly about kids getting beaten by cops on the Sunset Strip, but really about the feeling that something fundamental was breaking in America.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear, except it was becoming very clear. Barry Maguire's Eve of Destruction hit #1 in 1965 with lyrics that read like tomorrow's obituary.
The Eastern world, it is exploding, violence flaring, bullets loading. You're old enough to kill, but not for voting. You don't believe in war, but what's that gun you're toting? And even the Jordan River has bodies floating. But you tell me over and over and over again, my friend, you don't believe we're on the eve of destruction. No, you don't believe we're on the eve of destruction.
Radio stations banned it. Kids bought it anyway. The blueprint was set. Controversy sells and protest pays. But the real weapons were still to come. Creedence Clearwater Revival dropped Fortunate Son in 1969, and it hit like a grenade in every suburban living room. This wasn't flower power. This was class warfare. It ain't me. I ain't no senator's son. The genius of Fortunate Son was its specificity. It wasn't about war in the abstract. It was about rich kids getting deferments while poor kids got body bags. It named names. It pointed fingers. It made every draft-eligible kid understand exactly who was getting screwed. Country Joe and the Fish took it even further at Woodstock with Feel Like I'm Fixin' to Die Rag, a song so sarcastic it made cheering for war sound like a sick joke. Be the first one on your block to have your boy come home in a box. And then came Hendrix at Woodstock, taking the Star-Spangled Banner and ripping it apart with his teeth. Every feedback squeal was an artillery shell. Every dive bomb was a body falling. This wasn't protest music. This was musical warfare. What made Hendrix dangerous wasn't just the sound. It was the context. A black man taking the national anthem and turning it into a screaming indictment of American violence in front of 500,000 white kids who were nodding along. For 3 minutes and 43 seconds, Hendrix held a mirror up to America and showed it what it really looked like. Not the land of the free, the land of the napalmed. Not the home of the brave, the home of the body count. The anti-war arsenal was massive by 1969. Edwin Starr's War. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. The Temptations' Ball of Confusion. Sly and the Family Stone asking, what's so funny about peace, love, and understanding? But the question remained, were these songs changing minds or just preaching to the choir? Because for every kid singing along to Fortunate Son, there was another kid shipping out to Da Nang with Johnny Cash on his transistor radio. But the Electric Revolution wasn't just happening in America. 1968 was the year the whole world caught fire, and every uprising had its own amplified soundtrack. Paris, May '68. Students ripped up cobblestones and hurled them at riot cops while blasting songs that made Dylan sound like a lullaby. French protest singers like Dominique Grange turned revolution into electric chanson. The Sorbonne echoed with amplified chants that could be heard 3 arrondissements away.
La violence est partout, vous nous l'avez apprise, patrons qui exploitaient et flics qui matraquaient, mais à votre oppression, nous crions résistance, vous expulsez Kader, Mohamed se dresse, car on n'expulse pas la révolte du peuple, peuple qui se prépare à reprendre les armes que des traîtres lui ont volées en 45. Oui, bourgeois contre vous, le peuple veut la guerre. Nous sommes les nouveaux partisans, frontières de la guerre de classe. Le camp du peuple est notre camp. Nous sommes les nouveaux partisans.
But the French had learned something from watching American folk music get domesticated. You don't sing pretty songs about revolution. You make revolution sound like feedback and broken glass. Australia was sending troops to Vietnam too, and their protest music had the same electric teeth. AC/DC was still years away, but the folk clubs in Melbourne and Sydney were already plugging in, turning American anti-war songs into something louder, angrier, more dangerous. In Britain, the underground was going electric too. Pink Floyd wasn't just psychedelic, they were political. Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun wasn't space rock. It was nuclear anxiety with a backbeat.
Little by little, the night turns around, counting the leaves which tremble at dawn. Lotuses lean on each other in yearning.
crackdown was global too. American protest records were getting banned from radio stations across Europe, not by communist governments, but by allies who didn't want their own kids getting ideas. The BBC kept certain tracks off playlists. German stations pulled anti-war songs, because amplified revolution, it turns out, doesn't respect borders. From London to Tokyo, the same thing was happening. Young people with electric guitars, angry about the same wars, singing different words to the same rebellion. The acoustic folk songs that started in Greenwich Village coffee houses had become a global frequency, amplified, distorted, and impossible to ignore. Act 3. Woodstock, the high and the hustle. Which brings us to Woodstock. August 1969. 3 days of peace, music, and mud. 500,000 kids in a field, creating what looked like the revolution in real time. But was it? Or was it something else entirely? The myth says Woodstock was a utopia. No violence, no cops, just love and music and cosmic consciousness. And in some ways, that's true. You put 500,000 people in a field with minimal infrastructure, and somehow nobody got killed. That's either a miracle or proof that the counterculture actually worked. But let's talk about what the Woodstock documentary didn't show. Kids dying from bad acid, insulin-dependent diabetics going into a coma because they couldn't find medical tents, the food running out on day 2, the infrastructure collapsing so completely that the National Guard had to airlift in supplies. And while Hendrix was making his guitar scream the national anthem, corporate vultures were already circling overhead, taking notes on how to package this chaos for mass consumption. But let's focus on the music, because that's where the real story lives. Country Joe's famous anti-war cheer, "Give me an F, give me a U," got the biggest crowd response of the weekend. 500,000 people spelling out the word that summed up their feelings about the war, about the system, about everything. When they packaged it for vinyl later, cleaned up. When they played it on radio, censored. Even at the peak of the counterculture, someone else was holding the volume knob. Hendrix's Star-Spangled Banner performance happened at dawn on Monday morning, after most of the crowd had gone home. Maybe 30,000 people heard it live. But on film, on record, broadcast into millions of living rooms, it became the defining moment of the entire festival. Because here's what was really happening at Woodstock. Corporate America was getting a masterclass in youth marketing. They saw the headlines, saw the footage, and smelled profit. Within months, rebellion was a brand. Record executives packaged peace signs and sold them back to the kids who invented them. Advertisers turned blue jeans into a revolution you can wear. And the movement? It got monetized. The genius was that they didn't have to kill the counterculture. They just had to commercialize it, turn protest into product, make revolution safe for mass consumption. Which brings us to the bitter truth that no one wanted to face. Music didn't end the war. The Woodstock generation didn't stop the machine. All those songs, all that passion, all that beautiful chaos in the mud, and bombs kept falling in Vietnam for 4 more years. The system had learned its most important lesson yet. Don't silence rebellion, embrace it, package it. Sell it back to the rebels at a 400% markup. Act 4. So what did the Electric 60s actually accomplish? They proved that music could move mountains, and that capitalism could move faster. They showed that 500,000 people could gather peacefully in a field, and that corporate America could turn that gathering into a marketing strategy. The anti-war songs of the late 60s were more powerful, more urgent, more beautifully crafted than any protest music before or since. They had everything: Authenticity, passion, perfect melodies, devastating lyrics, and they lost. Because the machine learned something crucial from the folk scare of the early 60s. You don't have to silence dangerous music. You just have to wait it out, co-opt it, and sell it back to the people who created it. By 1970, the counterculture was exhausted. The war dragged on. Nixon was in the White House, and the kids who'd sung "We Shall Overcome" were graduating into a world that seemed just as broken as when they started. That's when protest music changed tactics. Instead of trying to stop wars, it started trying to save the planet. Instead of electric guitars screaming about body counts, acoustic guitars started whispering about disappearing forests. The amps went quiet. The crowds went home, and the next battle was already beginning. Not in a jungle halfway around the world, but right here. In the air we breathe, the water we drink, the soil beneath our feet. Next time, they paved paradise and put up a parking lot. The birth of environmental anthems, and how green music got swallowed by the very system it was trying to change.